beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to part 3 of How to Homebrew Beer. This part covers fermentation, moving on from part 2 where we looked at fermentation methods and yeast. So let's get started. I am yet again going to stress how important yeast and the resulting fermentation is to your end beer. To quote an old saying, brewers make wort, but yeast makes beer. You could be the best brewer in the world, but if something goes wrong during fermentation, then this can lead to critical failure. So let's now look at everything you can do in order to assist your yeast in its journey in turning your hop balanced sugar water into beer. Firstly, always ensure that your yeast is healthy before using it for a brew's fermentation. Both dry and liquid yeast should be stored in a refrigerator and used before the expiry date. If your yeast has expired, then by simply making a starter will often bring it back to life. More on starters shortly. Always ensure that you pitch the correct amount of yeast for your given beer. Many yeast companies will have their own pitch rate calculators, like the one shown on screen now from Lallemand. In this example I am using a Nottingham yeast with a starting gravity of 1.065 within a volume of 25 litres with a temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. You can see here that it suggests using 17.7 grams of yeast, meaning that you will need 2 sachets. However, this is simply a yeast company who are urging on the side of caution, which is not unusual of course, so the pitch rate here reflects that. For some this is certainly not a bad thing, but I recommend that you are in control of the pitch rate yourself, or at least aware of the rate that is being used. For example, a small underpitch of yeast can be useful in bringing out more esters, which are the yeast's contribution to flavour. You will also find that certain yeast types benefit from different pitching rates. To calculate and control all of this will mean using different tools. Brewing software will allow you to control your pitch rate more finely. Brewfather, for example, has its own pitch rate section that also covers starters. Let's start off by focusing on the left with pitch rate. You can see here that by selecting the pitch rate menu we can change the rate between common settings depending on gravity and beer type. Higher gravity beers and lager yeast require higher pitch rates, as you can see here. So in this case, if we go for a lower pitch rate, then we will have the need for just 11 grams of yeast, which means just using 1 sachet. This is 13 billion cells per gram, equating to 144 billion cells in total. However, if we step the pitch rate up to a higher one that will work for beers up to 1.060, then you can now see the pitch rate has changed. If you wish to fine-tune things even further going between these common pitch rates, then you can use the slider here to dial in exactly what you have in mind, and you can see that the target pitch and yeast amounts change in real time as you do this. Let's now bring back the yeast starter section of this calculator and talk about yeast starters. Starters are more normal to use with liquid yeast due to the cost compared to dry yeast, but they can certainly be used with dry yeast and to build up yeast health within yeast that is close or past its expiry date, as spoke about earlier. In this example we are using 1 sachet of yeast as shown here. You can also use the slider or preset pitch rates for starters in the same way that you would for pitching yeast directly for an actual brew. The starter will reculture your 1 sachet or package of yeast into more yeast. The additional cost of doing this being dried malt extract, which is shortened here to DME. It should be mentioned that I am showing the stir plate version of this, but there is an option in Brewfather for no stir too. Making a yeast starter is really simple. You just add the water and dried malt extract to a pot and boil it for 15 minutes on your stove. The liquid element is then transferred into a suitable container for the starter and cooled. You then pitch your yeast into it for a fermentation on your stir plate. Once this fermentation is over, you can then pitch the whole starter into your wort or cool it down in a fridge, allowing all of the yeast to drop down so that you can then decant most of the liquid and just pitch a smaller amount of liquid along with the yeast. This is my preferred method. Another very advisable thing to use is yeast nutrients. Yeast nutrients are added during the boil stage of a starter as shown here, or the late boil stage of a beer brew. They do not need to be expensive, and I recommend using nutrients that are sold as being zinc enriched for the very best of results. Yeast nutrients are essentially an insurance policy for your beer's fermentation. The funny thing about insurance is you never really know when you are going to need it, and with yeast nutrients you will not exactly know when they kept things back on track for you, but that's exactly what they will do. Some will say that they have never needed them and all has been fine, but there is always potential for that to change, and I will add that a healthy yeast will always give you a better fermentation result. Let's now look at how to pitch yeast. Going back some years ago, a recommended practice was to rehydrate yeast within water, stirring it before pitching. Studies were carried out by fermenters in recent years, and it was found that in actual fact the use of water had no beneficial results over pitching directly into wort, and that stirring the yeast led to cell death. So now the very best way to rehydrate your yeast is by pitching it directly into your wort while you're transferring chilled wort into your fermenter, as you see me doing here, and using the wort to rehydrate the yeast quickly. I have found that this is by far the best method I have used to date, and my fermentations are quick to start and finish at a good level of final gravity. When using yeast that is straight from a sachet, then I do not aerate the wort anymore, other than simply splashing it into my fermenter. However, if I am using recultured yeast that I have either dried or kept as liquid, or commercial liquid yeast, then I will use a paddle connected to a drill for some minutes for aeration before pitching the yeast. The next area of importance is around temperature. Different types of yeast will require different temperatures, but it is important to know that temperature stability is very important no matter which type of yeast you are using, and this stability is important for regular fermentations and fermentations under pressure. For true stability, it is best to have your heating and cooling direct to your fermenter. This can be as simple as a fermentation fridge that has heated added in, which is controlled by a temperature controller, or it could be a fermenter that has heating built in and has a glycol chiller attached. Let's now look at different categories of yeast, their temperature zones and relative advice. Firstly, on the lowest temperature range we have lager yeast. Most lager yeast works within a range of between 9 to 13 degrees Celsius, which is 48 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. For many to ferment with temperature stability in this range, they will need either a fermentation fridge or a glycol chiller setup. However, if you cannot manage this, then lagers are ideal for fermentation under pressure, which will negate the issues of higher temperatures. Lager yeast is the slowest of the yeast types to ferment when fermented at low temperatures. It can take up to 3 weeks to finish. Having said this, there are some methods that involve gradual temperature rises that would speed this up that work well. At the very least, it is smart to raise your temperature in the final days of fermentation to 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit with lager yeast. This is best done when you are 5 points away from your predicted final gravity and is known as a diacetyl rest, as it helps to clean up diacetyl and at the same time helps to fully attenuate your beer. Be sure to perform this step for at least 2 days. Next we have regular ale yeast, which is usually fermented at between 18 to 21 degrees Celsius, which is approximately 64 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Once again, you will need stability of temperature, but you can also use pressure to combat higher temperatures. Do be aware though that ale yeast for most styles is characterized by its flavors and aromas, which will be removed if you use pressure fermentation. A British ale, for example, without the characteristic fruity yeast contributions is never going to be quite the same. There is a workaround here though. Because yeast adds in flavour and aroma contributions within the first 4 days of fermentation, you can add pressure after this point. This method works great for any type of yeast too, just to be clear. A normal ale yeast fermentation time is up to 2 weeks, and you can also perform a diacetyl rest with ale yeast, though due to the temperature of fermentation it's not as relevant as it is with lager yeast. Even so, pushing the temperature into the yeast high zone for the last 2 to 3 days can be useful with ale yeast to actually ensure full attenuation. Then we have saison yeast, which is still ale yeast, but it is fermented at higher temperatures, moving sometimes up to as high as 35 degrees Celsius, which is the equivalent of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Saison yeast is all about its flavours and aromas, so as such not suitable for 100% pressure fermentation. Fermentation time with saison yeast is going to be up to about 2 weeks, but it's usually done in half this time. Then finally we have kveik yeast, which started in Norway and is my most used type of yeast by a long way. You will find many kveik related videos on my channel. Like saison yeast, this is also a farmhouse style ale yeast, but some types can be fermented as high as 42 degrees Celsius or 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Like with all yeast, the higher you ferment within its temperature range, the more flavour and aroma you can enjoy in the end beer, and the faster the fermentation will be. Kveik is known for fermenting fast and conditioning fast too. Even the strongest of beers can be ready to drink in 6 weeks compared to many months when fermented by regular yeast. A normal fermentation time with kveik when used at high temperatures is between 1 to 3 days, and this can often be shortened to less than 24 hours if pressure is used alongside a higher temperature. There are many different types of Quake out there, ranging from lager-like to very flavourful saison-style results. Due to this, there are many different beer styles that you can cover with Quake, but certainly not all. Unlike all other yeast, Quake does not require temperature stability. In fact, you can have wild swings in temperature and it will just keep going. To finish off, I have 3 more quick tips for you. Firstly, the airlock is not a way to judge fermentation. Yes, it's great to see a busy airlock, but do not judge that a beer is finished when this stops. The only true way to judge if a beer is actually finished in fermentation is by using a hydrometer and seeing consistent gravity results across at least 3 days. After this point, it is then safe to bottle or transfer into a keg, but it is actually good practice to wait for some more days before doing this so that your yeast can clean up after itself. If you check the gravity and note that your yeast has not fully done its job but the fermentation has actually stopped, then I suggest that you check the temperature that the yeast can handle and raise it up to the maximum of this range. During this time where the temperature is being raised, you should then rock your fermenter as shown here for a couple of minutes. This is known as rousing your yeast and will 9 times out of 10 get things back on track again. Do keep in mind though that your final gravity is simply an estimate, so being a few points out either way is not uncommon. Finally, the last tip is to be patient. Some beer styles like wheat beer and IPAs are designed to be drunk very fresh, but other styles will benefit from 4 to 6 weeks of conditioning time, and the very strong beers are going to be best after quite some months. Certainly you could speed this up with Quake yeast, but then you're still going to be best to wait 6 weeks for a stronger style. If you plan ahead well, then you can always have beer that's in a conditioned and ready state to drink at all times. I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!